At 3 a.m., the world is quieter. The streets are empty, the wind is softer, and thoughts slow down. It's a time when the mind drifts, neither fully awake nor asleep. And in that space, something unexpected begins to grow. Moss. It's not loud, it doesn't demand attention, but it has been here longer than most things. It clings to trees, stones, forgotten places, breathing quietly through centuries. This video is not about answers, it's about paying attention to something so small, soft and slow, to life that happens when no one is watching. We will explore the hidden world of moss, not with urgency, but with patience, with curiosity, with stillness. So let yourself sink into the silence. Dim the lights. Close your eyes if you like, and let your thoughts trail off like spores in a breeze. Because at 3 a.m., even the smallest things deserve to be seen. Long before trees stretched toward the sky, before insects buzzed through pollen-rich air, before flowers colored the land, there was moss. The fossil record places the origin of mosses roughly 470 million years ago in the Ordovician period. That's over 200 million years before the first dinosaurs appeared. They are among the earliest land plants, and their arrival marks one of the most significant transitions in Earth's history, life's movement from water to land. Unlike vascular plants, mosses have no roots, no true leaves, and no complex tissue to transport water. Instead, they absorb moisture and nutrients directly through their surfaces. In that simplicity lies their genius. Early Earth was a barren, rocky surface exposed to radiation, erosion, and a volatile climate. It's believed that mosses, alongside other bryophytes, played a critical role in transforming that harsh landscape. By clinging to stone, breaking down minerals with acids, and creating a thin layer of organic material, they helped create the first soil. They softened the earth for everything that came after. Modern genetic analyses, including studies published in journals like Nature Plants and Current Biology, show that mosses diverged early from other plant lineages. They are neither ancestors of trees nor evolutionary dead ends. They are a separate branch, a quiet parallel story in the tree of life. They reproduce using spores, not seeds. Their life cycle follows an ancient rhythm, alternation of generations, where the gametophyte, the green, leafy structure we recognize as moss, is the dominant phase. It produces gametes, and after fertilization, a stalk rises to release spores, beginning the cycle again. No flowers, no fruit, just continuity. Through time, mosses adapted to deserts, tundra, rainforests, and even urban concrete. Today, there are over 16,000 known species, depending on classification, found on every continent, including Antarctica. Some grow only a few millimeters tall. Others, like Dawsonia superba in New Zealand, can reach over 50 centimeters. They have no defenses, they do not move, but they persist, and in doing so, they teach us something about resilience. At first glance, moss appears almost formless, soft, uniform, green, a carpet. But look closer, especially beneath a lens, and an entire architecture reveals itself. An ancient, elegant design, refined over hundreds of millions of years. Mosses lack the vascular systems found in most land plants. There are no xylem or phloem tissues, no internal highways for water and sugar. Instead, mosses rely on capillary action and surface absorption. This means they are incredibly sensitive to moisture in their surroundings. When it rains, they swell. When it dries, they shrink. Some species can lose up to 98% of their water content, entering a state of suspended animation. then rehydrate and revive within minutes. This ability, known as desiccation tolerance, is still not fully understood. But researchers at institutions like the University of Cambridge and Kyoto University are studying its potential in biomedicine and crop science. The way mosses repair their cellular membranes after drying could inspire new technologies in preservation and drought resilience. What we call a moss plant is primarily the gametophyte. It consists of rhizoids, root-like filaments that anchor the moss but do not absorb nutrients, stems, often simple and unbranched, though some are ornate, phyllids, tiny leaf-like structures, typically only one cell layer thick. These phyllids are what catch light, rain, and dew. In many species, they spiral tightly, creating dense cushions. This structure helps retain moisture and creates microhabitats, tiny worlds that shelter insects, tardigrades, fungi, and other mosses. Mosses don't grow vertically. They expand outward, forming mats, tufts, or wefts, depending on the species and environment. In forests, mosses creep along fallen logs, stone walls, and tree trunks, filling in every available space with soft geometry. Some species, like sphagnum, lack rhizoids entirely and grow in waterlogged conditions. Their cells have large internal vacuoles that absorb up to 20 times their dry weight in water. This makes them essential in wetland ecosystems where they form peat bogs, massive carbon sinks vital for regulating the planet's climate. The surface of moss, when examined under a microscope, reveals hydrophobic cells, tiny pores, and crystalline textures. Its aesthetic simplicity belies a functional complexity. Each part of the moss has one purpose: to endure without demanding, to survive where little else can. In 2023, a study published in Plant Physiology used transcriptomic profiling to compare the desiccation response of Syntrichia ruralis, a desert moss from the American Southwest, with temperate species like Bryum argenteum. The researchers found that the desert moss had a unique suite of early response genes activated within minutes of water loss, linked to UV protection, lipid preservation, and chloroplast stability. These mechanisms are not just of academic interest. NASA's exobiology program has considered mosses like Tortula ruralis as model organisms for understanding life's potential resilience on Mars. Their ability to survive in a desiccated state for months, then revive with water, suggests they could withstand interplanetary travel or be used in long-term bioregenerative life support systems. Mosses inhabit some of the harshest environments on Earth, where water is not abundant but often arrives in sudden, intense episodes. In arid deserts, mosses may only hydrate a few times a year. In these places, survival depends on instant activation. In the Atacama Desert, one of the driest regions on Earth, researchers have documented populations of Bryum argenteum growing on shaded rock faces. These mosses enter a state of cryptobiosis, essentially pausing all metabolic function until brief morning fogs provide just enough moisture to trigger rehydration. Meanwhile, in Antarctica, mosses such as Sanyonia uncinata grow near meltwater streams and glacial edges. Temperatures may remain below freezing for most of the year, and light levels fluctuate wildly. Yet during short summers, these mosses photosynthesize, reproduce, and store energy in dense mats that can insulate themselves against ice damage. A 2024 study from the Australian Antarctic Division used satellite imagery combined with thermal imaging to map moss growth across exposed coastal rock in East Antarctica. Findings revealed that mosses contribute significantly to local microclimate regulation, lowering surface temperature by up to 2.5 degrees Celsius and increasing water retention in rocky soil by 30%. These adaptations are not uniform. Different species have evolved distinct strategies for coping with their hydric environment, creating a diversity of water management blueprints within the Bryophyta division. Hydration in mosses is often intertwined with light exposure. While water is essential, it can amplify light-related stress. Wet moss reflects and refracts more light, increasing the potential for photoinhibition, damage to the photosynthetic machinery due to excess sunlight. To mitigate this, some mosses produce pigments like flavonoids and anthocyanins, which act as sunscreen. Others orient their phyllids vertically during peak sunlight, or curl them inward to reduce exposure. In alpine species, UV-absorbing cells have been documented, protecting chloroplasts during snowmelt when sunlight is especially intense due to reflection off ice. Recent work by the Plant Adaptation Lab at Kyoto University showed that in Rhacometrium lanuginosum, a high-altitude moss, photosynthetic efficiency actually increases after a desiccation rehydration cycle, an unusual phenomenon attributed to temporary increases in specific antioxidant compounds. Mosses are not simply reacting to light and water, they are optimizing both simultaneously. This dual adaptation allows them to occupy ecological niches inaccessible to most vascular plants. In the quiet understory of a forest, on the wind-swept edges of tundra, even in the cracks of a city sidewalk, mosses do not live in isolation. Their soft green forms are not simply static carpets of photosynthetic cells. They are living architectures, hosting a complex web of interactions. Around and within their tiny leaves, in the thin films of water that cling to them, entire worlds unfold. Let us explore those worlds, the organisms that depend on moss, the chemical and biological conversations mosses have with their surroundings, and the subtle ways they shape and are shaped by the living network of Earth. To truly understand moss's role in the web of life, one must shrink to its scale. Imagine yourself standing among its phyllids, the tiny leaf-like structures. To an insect smaller than a millimeter, each phylid is a towering blade, each droplet a lake, each gap between stems a canyon. Inside these miniature landscapes, moss hosts communities of extraordinary diversity. Microfauna, rotifers, nematodes, tardigrades, and protozoa thrive in the moist microhabitats. Many of these animals can survive desiccation alongside the moss, reviving when water returns. Microflora, algae, fungi, and cyanobacteria grow interwoven with moss tissue, often in mutually beneficial relationships. Invertebrates, mites, springtails, and small spiders use moss as shelter, hunting ground, or breeding site. Vertebrates. In some habitats, moss is used by amphibians, reptiles, and even birds as nesting material or protective cover. In a 2024 study published in Biodiversity and Conservation, researchers used DNA metabarcoding to examine moss samples from 12 global biomes. They found that a single gram of moss could contain over 1,000 distinct taxa, many of them unknown to science. Few creatures are as famous for resilience as the tardigrade, sometimes called the water bear, and moss is among their preferred habitats. The connection is more than coincidental. The water films on moss provide the exact conditions tardigrades need to stay hydrated, feed on algae or plant cells, and reproduce. Like moss, tardigrades can survive complete desiccation by entering a cryptobiotic state. Their metabolism slows to 0.01% of normal. Their bodies contract into a ton, a protective ball, and they produce protective sugars that preserve their cells. In this state, both moss and tardigrade can survive extreme cold, heat, and even space vacuum. Research in 2023 from the University of Vienna examined co-occurrence patterns of mosses and tardigrade species in alpine habitats. It found that moss diversity was a stronger predictor of tardigrade diversity than overall vegetation cover, indicating that moss provides not just habitat, but microhabitat specificity that shapes animal distribution. Many mosses host cyanobacteria within or upon their tissues. These bacteria fix atmospheric nitrogen into forms that plants can use, a crucial service in nutrient-poor environments. Sphagnum mosses, in particular, have well-documented associations with nitrogen-fixing cyanobacteria. In bog ecosystems, these partnerships can supply up to 50% of the available nitrogen, sustaining the growth of other plants as well. Interestingly, the relationship is not static. In low nitrogen conditions, sphagnum increases the abundance of cyanobacteria on its leaves, essentially inviting more of these microbial partners. Similarly, mosses form partnerships with mycorrhizal fungi and other endophytic fungi. While mosses lack roots, fungal hyphae can grow into dead moss tissue or the spaces between living cells, helping to decompose organic matter and recycle nutrients in situ. A 2025 review in New Phytologist described these moss-fungus interactions as a proto-mycorrhizal system, offering insights into how early land plants may have partnered with fungi before the evolution of true roots. Beyond the microscopic scale, moss plays a role in the lives of larger animals. Birds, for instance, frequently use moss as nesting material. Its softness, moisture retention, and antimicrobial properties make it ideal for lining nests. Species like the long-tailed tit and various hummingbirds weave moss into elaborate structures. Some birds, such as the common wren, even prefer moss with higher concentrations of certain secondary metabolites, which may deter parasites. Mammals also make use of moss. In boreal forests, red squirrels and voles incorporate moss into their dens for insulation. Reindeer in Arctic regions sometimes graze on certain moss species in winter, though lichens are their primary forage. Moss mats act as living filters, trapping airborne particles, spores, and even pollutants. This filtering capacity benefits the organisms within the moss as much as the surrounding environment. By removing dust and particulates from the air and slowing water flow across surfaces, moss mats create cleaner, more stable habitats. In forest streams, aquatic mosses such as Fontanalis antipyretica filter sediments and provide spawning grounds for fish like trout and salmon. In Japan, certain river mosses are considered indicators of water purity, with their health directly linked to the absence of industrial contaminants. Though lacking flowers or seeds, mosses are not silent in chemical terms. They release secondary metabolites, organic compounds not directly involved in growth, that can influence the growth of neighboring plants, fungi, and microbes. Some moss species exude phenolic compounds that inhibit the germination of vascular plant seeds, reducing competition for light and moisture. Others produce antimicrobial chemicals that limit bacterial or fungal growth on their surfaces. Chemical ecology studies from 2022 to 2025 have identified dozens of such compounds. some with potential pharmaceutical applications. For example, sphagnum produces sphagnin, a pectic-like polysaccharide with strong antimicrobial properties, which is partly responsible for the exceptional preservation of bodies found in ancient peat bogs. In polar and alpine regions, moss often partners with lichens, creating mosaics of vegetation that protect soil from erosion and retain warmth. The combined cover of moss and lichen can increase soil temperature by up to 2 degrees Celsius and double water retention compared to bare ground. These partnerships are not only physical but biological. Mosses may benefit from the nitrogen-fixing cyanobacteria living in lichens, while lichens gain moisture from moss's sponge-like structure. Humans, too, have a long history with moss. Indigenous peoples across the world have used moss for insulation, bedding, wound dressing, and even diapers, taking advantage of its softness and absorbency. In horticulture, moss is valued for its moisture-retaining qualities. Sphagnum moss is a staple in orchid cultivation and seed germination. In Japan, moss gardens are cultural treasures designed to embody tranquility and the passage of time. Ethnobotanical records show that mosses have been used in food storage, as natural refrigeration in warm climates, and in ceremonial contexts. These uses reflect an intuitive understanding of moss's functional properties long before scientific analysis confirmed them. Mosses contribute to ecosystem resilience not only as individuals, but as interconnected communities. By stabilizing soil, enhancing water retention, and supporting diverse life forms, mosses act as keystone species in many habitats. The removal of moss from an ecosystem often leads to cascading effects. Soil dries faster, erosion increases, microbial communities shift, and species dependent on moss for shelter or food decline. Conversely, the restoration of moss can accelerate ecosystem recovery, something increasingly recognized in ecological restoration projects worldwide. To walk through a moss-rich forest is to move through overlapping worlds, the visible, towering one of trees and shrubs, and the unseen, intricate one underfoot. In that second world, moss is both stage and player, hosting, sheltering, feeding, filtering, communicating. Its symbioses are not static contracts, but dynamic exchanges shaped by weather, season, and climate. They speak to a truth that scales across biology. Survival is rarely a solitary act. It is a weaving together of many threads, some strong, some delicate, into a fabric that can hold through centuries. Moss does not just exist within the web of life. It is one of its most patient, persistent weavers. In the stillness of a moss carpet, it's easy to imagine that nothing moves. Yet the life of moss is full of motion, just not the kind our eyes are trained to see. For mosses, travel is measured in dust motes and drifting air, in droplets of rain and the feet of passing animals. They spread not with the swiftness of birds or the strides of deer, but with a patience honed over hundreds of millions of years. The quiet persistence of moss lies in its ability to arrive, sometimes across a stone's breadth, sometimes across oceans, and to make a home where life seems impossible. At the heart of moss mobility are its spores, microscopic packages of potential, built to endure and to wait. Produced in vast numbers within the capsules of the sporophyte generation, these spores are light enough to be carried by air currents for miles, sometimes hundreds of kilometers, yet resilient enough to survive harsh conditions during the journey. Most moss spores measure between 10 and 50 micrometers in diameter. At this scale, They are influenced not only by gravity and wind speed, but also by Brownian motion, random molecular movements in the air. This means their path is not straightforward, but a dance of unpredictable swirls and pauses. A 2024 study in Annals of Botany used high-speed imaging to capture spore release in Funaria hygrometrica. The peristome teeth of its capsule respond to changes in humidity, snapping open in dry air and closing in moist air. This hygroscopic mechanism times release for moments when spores are most likely to be carried away, avoiding heavy rain that might drop them too close to the parent plant. Not all spores travel far. In fact, many fall within a few centimeters of the parent gametophyte, creating dense local colonies. But some, lifted by gusts, carried in thermals, or swept high into the atmosphere, join what ecologists call the spore rain that constantly drifts down over the planet. Aerobiological surveys in 2023 over the North Atlantic found viable moss spores at altitudes of more than 3,000 meters embedded in atmospheric dust plumes. Some of these likely originated from continents thousands of kilometers away. Long-distance dispersal is rare in probability, but significant in impact. A single spore landing in a suitable, unoccupied habitat can spark the colonization of an entire landscape over decades. While air is the primary vector for most moss spores, water plays a key role in certain species and environments. Streamside mosses such as Fontinalis and Platyhypnidium can release spores or vegetative fragments directly into the water, allowing them to drift downstream to new anchor points. In coastal ecosystems, fragments of moss can survive saltwater exposure long enough to travel between islands. In 2025, marine botanists studying debris washed ashore in the Aleutian Islands found intact moss fragments with viable propagules, likely transported on kelp rafts or floating pumice. Many mosses also travel by hitchhiking. Tiny spores and plant fragments can adhere to the feet, fur, or feathers of animals. Migratory birds in particular are thought to play an important role in connecting distant moss populations. A groundbreaking 2024 genetic study in molecular ecology examined moss DNA from wetlands along the migratory routes of the northern pine-tailed duck. The researchers found strong genetic similarities between moss populations, separated by thousands of kilometers, suggesting repeated long-distance dispersal events facilitated by the birds. Small mammals, insects, and even amphibians may also carry spores on their bodies or in mud clinging to them. In tundra ecosystems, reindeer and caribou trample moss mats, breaking them into fragments that stick to their hooves and are carried to new grazing grounds. When a moss spore lands in a new environment, the first challenge is not growth, it is survival. Bare rock, volcanic ash, glacial moraine, and abandoned construction sites are all habitats where mosses can be the first to arrive. Mosses are pioneer species, meaning they can establish themselves in places too extreme for most vascular plants. They anchor themselves with rhizoids, secrete organic acids to break down mineral surfaces, and trap dust and debris to form the first layers of soil. One of the most dramatic examples of moss colonization comes from Iceland's volcanic landscapes. Following the 2010 eruption of Ecological, surveys found moss spores germinating on the cooled lava within 2 years. By 2020, moss carpets were widespread, stabilizing the ash and providing microhabitats for insects and fungi. cities present a surprisingly rich field for moss colonization. While urban environments are harsh, exposed to pollution, heat, and rapid drying, they also offer countless microhabitats: brick walls, tiled roofs, shaded gutters, and cracks in the pavement. Urban moss species such as Bryum argenteum and Ceratodon purpureus are pollution-tolerant and can withstand rapid wet-dry cycles. These species often spread via vegetative fragments as well as spores, allowing them to colonize tiny, transient patches of moisture. Urban ecology projects in Berlin and Melbourne have begun to encourage moss growth on green roofs and walls, recognizing its potential for cooling, sound absorption, and biodiversity support. In these projects, moss is often introduced by blending fragments into a slurry and applying it to surfaces, mimicking natural vegetative colonization. Dormancy is not just a survival mechanism, it is a colonization strategy. Spores can remain viable for years, waiting for conditions to become favorable. This temporal dispersal means that a spore landing in a currently inhospitable site can bide its time until rainfall, shade, or nutrient levels improve. Laboratory studies in 2025 on Physcomitrium patens spores stored under controlled conditions showed germination rates above 80%, even after 15 years. In the field, spores buried in soil seed banks may last even longer, protected from UV radiation and temperature extremes. How far and how often moss disperses affects its genetic diversity. Populations connected by frequent spore exchange maintain higher genetic variation, which can increase resilience to environmental change. Isolated populations, by contrast, may become genetically distinct over time, adapting to very specific local conditions. Landscape genetic studies of Rhacometrium lanuginosum in alpine Europe have revealed strong genetic structuring across mountain ranges, suggesting that while occasional long-distance dispersal occurs, most reproduction happens locally, leading to unique adaptations in each range. Arrival does not guarantee establishment. For a moss colony to take root, conditions must allow protonema growth and eventual gametophyte development. Too much sun, too little moisture, or competition from vascular plants can prevent successful colonization. In some cases, mosses act as ephemeral colonizers, establishing quickly on disturbed soil but disappearing as shrubs and trees move in. In others, they persist for centuries, shaping the environment so completely that they become foundational species. In the grand scale of plant colonization, moss is the slow, persistent traveler. It does not dominate by force, but by resilience. It arrives quietly, holds on, and changes the conditions around it until staying becomes inevitable. From the wind currents that lift its spores to the volcanic rock that welcomes its first green threads, moss reminds us that motion need not be hurried to be effective. Its journeys are as much about waiting as they are about moving. And in the stillness between departure and arrival, the next green world begins. At first glance, moss seems only to receive water. It waits for rain, for mist, for dew. But the longer you look, the more you see the opposite is also true. Moss doesn't just accept moisture, it organizes it. It bends it to gentle purposes. It holds, releases, lifts, and slows it. It spreads thin films of water across surfaces and laces droplets through canopies. It builds a quieter hydrology, one fitted to shadow and stillness. Now we slow down enough to see that hidden architecture, to see how moss manipulates humidity, temperature, and the movement of water across bark, stone, soil, and air, to see how it shapes the spaces where other life can breathe. Mosses live in the realm of surface, the delicate border where air meets matter. Without xylem or phloem, they draw water not from within but from without, using capillary forces between overlapping fillets, along tiny ridges, and through microchannels where liquid clings and slides. A single cushion is a city of narrow spaces. In those spaces, water ignores gravity and moves because adhesion and cohesion say it can. When the air is damp, a transparent film slicks the leaves. In that film, gases dissolve. Photosynthesis resumes. When the air dries, the film thins, breaks, beads into droplets, and then disappears until the next breath of fog. This constant switching between wetted and dry states is not failure but design. It allows moss to operate in pulses, to stay ready without wasting energy in drought. In genera like Polytrichum, leaf lamellae raise photosynthetic tissue off the leaf surface, increasing contact with humid air and reducing evaporative loss during bright breaks in clouds. Micro-roughness on many moss leaves enhances capillarity while also creating hydrophobic beading that sheds excess water, a balance between taking and letting go that keeps tissues aerated and clean. Rain isn't the only sky river. In cloud forests, cool air drifts through canopies and leaves wetness behind. Epiphytic mats, bryophytes and lichens woven together, intercept fog, store it, then drip it downwards. This is horizontal precipitation, water arriving not by falling, but by brushing. Because fog forms under high humidity and low solar radiation, intercepted water is less likely to evaporate and more likely to reach soil as slow, additional input. In some montane forests, this subtle pathway supports stream flow through the dry season, one droplet at a time. Walk barefoot from bare soil onto a thick moss carpet and you can feel the temperature change. Moss moderates peaks. It lowers scorching daytime highs near the surface and softens cold snaps at night. Matt slow wind raise humidity just above the ground and reduce the rate at which soil loses water. In doing so, they create microclimates with narrower swings, safer for fungi, seedlings, salamanders, and the microscopic fauna that live in water films. Field and modeling studies show that near-surface maxima in sun-exposed patches can exceed 50 degrees Celsius at a few centimeters height. Shaded, mossy patches remain dramatically cooler. Temperature buffering propagates upward and outward. Stabilize the first 2 centimeters, and you improve the layer above. This small stability scales from centimeters to stands, from hours to seasons. No moss engineers water like sphagnum. Its leaves are packed with hyaline cells, large, dead reservoirs ringed with pores that can hold astonishing amounts of water. Together with capillary spaces between leaves and stems, these reservoirs allow sphagnum to store 20 to 25 times its dry mass in water, then release it slowly to its surroundings. In bogs, where oxygen is scarce and acidity is high, that stored water slows decomposition and locks carbon into peat. A peatland is a slow hydrological machine. Rain in, water held high, streams fed gently. Raise the water table and peat accumulates. Lower it and the peat breathes out carbon. Though they cover only 3% of land, peatlands hold up to 25 to 30% of global soil carbon, a planetary consequence of moss deciding to be wet. Every forest redistributes rain, some to leaves, then air, some to throughfall, some to stem flow. Bryophytes, in the canopy as epiphytes, in the understory as mats, amplify storage and delay. On branches, epiphytic bryophytes briefly capture rain and fog, then turn them into slow drip. On the ground, carpets curb overland flow and let water migrate laterally and down. Studies suggest that non-vascular epiphytes can contribute materially to total rainfall interception in montane systems, and that moss-rich canopies store more water per unit mass than bare branches. Even where their fractional cover is small, bryophytes can be lever arms in hydrology because they act at critical interfaces, air-leaf and leaf soil. On bare rock, moss starts the slow work of making ground. Acids etch mineral. Dust is trapped. When rain comes, a few millimeters of living sponge keep the first layer from washing away. In young soils, moss stabilizes aggregates, reduces crusting, and increases infiltration. In older soils, it acts like mulch without the decay rate, shading the surface, feeding microbes with exudates, and regulating the intensity of drying after sun breaks. Soils with moss behave differently from soils without it. A global field synthesis showed that areas covered by soil mosses support up to 6.43 gigatons more carbon in the top soil layer than comparable bare soils, while also hosting richer nutrient pools and fewer plant pathogens. 6.43 gigatons more carbon, the top soil layer than comparable bare soils, while also hosting richer nutrient pools and fewer plant pathogens. In other words, when moss is present, the ground breathes more slowly and keeps more of what it needs. Not all moss is terrestrial. Aquatic mosses cling to stones in cold streams. Their fronds slow flow in microeddies, settle fine sediment, and provide stable spawning niches for insects and fish. In shaded headwaters, where temperature depends on contact with air more than sunlight, these submerged mats act like chill pads, buffering diurnal swings. The moss here does what it always does. It alters interfaces. Water meets stone more slowly. Food webs find footholds. In catchments downstream of moss-rich headwaters, early season clarity tends to be higher. Bottom life has time to start. Urban air holds heat. Concrete sheds water quickly. After a storm, gutters rush, then everything dries. In this pulse and pause hydrology, moss can act like a quiet capacitor. On bricks and roof tiles, moss roughens surfaces and adds thin storage that delays runoff minutes to hours. On shaded walls, it lifts local humidity enough that nearby ferns or lichens can persist. On green roofs and living walls, it contributes to evaporative cooling and particle capture, especially where vascular plants struggle with shallow substrates and intermittent care. Peer-reviewed evaluations of indoor VOC removal by moss walls are still emerging and sometimes mixed, but field and lab evidence support moss's role as a bioindicator and passive particle sink in outdoor air, with growing interest in urban pilot projects that monitor heavy metals and particulates via moss panels. As heat waves lengthen and rainfall concentrates into fewer, heavier events, the way water moves at the ground becomes more erratic. For moss, the response is ancient, poikilohydry, to dry with the world and rehydrate when moisture returns. Yet even moss has thresholds. Prolonged vapor pressure deficits can collapse films before photosynthesis can use them. Repeated scorch-dry cycles can thin mats. In peatlands, lowering water tables turns carbon sponges into slow chimneys. In forests, removing moss from the floor can reduce soil moisture and widen temperature swings, making seedlings and invertebrates more vulnerable. Conversely, practices that maintain shaded structure, retention patches, coarse woody debris, canopy diversity, enhance microclimate buffering that benefits moss communities and everything that relies on them. Life rides those water films. Rotifers uncoil, nematodes slither through microlakes, springtails graze on biofilms. Cyanobacteria fix nitrogen in dim, wet corners of sphagnum leaves, feeding entire food webs where soil is poor. In these places, humidity is habitat, and moss decides where humidity rests. Recent global work confirmed what bryologists have long seen locally. Where vascular plants are sparse, soil mosses shoulder a disproportionate share of the ecosystem's service load. Carbon support, nutrient pools, pathogen suppression, by stabilizing the small water that makes all the small lives possible. There's another dimension to this architecture that data rarely capture: texture. The sound of a mossy path after rain is not the same as gravel. It absorbs footsteps, lowers echo, makes night closer. In cities, living walls and vegetated facades can reduce reflected noise. Moss, with its porous structure, adds absorption at human speech frequencies while also buffering humidity at the wall surface. The metrics are urban design specific, but the principle echoes the forest: slow the air, roughen the surface, hold a little water nearby, and the environment becomes quieter, cooler, kinder, not by much but enough to matter. Where peatlands were drained, re-wetting begins with the sponge, not the tree. Block the ditches. Let the water rise. Replant sphagnum, often with diaspores sprayed from drones or scattered as donor fragments. Once established, the hyaline reservoir and capillary web turn rainfall into storage again. Methane pulses may accompany the early re-wet period, but long-term carbon balance improves as peat formation resumes. The gains are not instant, but they are cumulative. Restored bogs reset the local microclimate: cooler summer surfaces, smaller diurnal swings, higher humidity. Downstream, flashy storm peaks flatten a little. In a century shaped by extremes, small flattenings add up. Moss is not an invention of wet places, it is a maker of them. It builds memory into landscapes, the memory of rain. In cloud forests, a branch that should be dry stays slightly wet longer. On city brick, a line of green holds dew through dawn. On open ground, a shallow mat keeps the day from biting as hard. In bogs, 1,000,000 hyaline cells lift the water table for an entire valley. None of this is dramatic. It's a choreography of increments, a redirecting of flows so subtle you need to breathe slower to see it. But seen or not, it gives other lives time. Time to sprout, to feed, to hide, to cross a dry week. If a forest is a large climate, moss is a small one, nested inside, deliberate, meticulous. A climate of seconds and centimeters, of films and drips, of quiet. And in a world that feels increasingly abrupt, there is comfort in the things that still move slowly. From the dripping canopies of tropical rainforests to the icy silence of Antarctica, moss has mastered the art of survival across nearly every terrestrial environment. Our journey leads us through the planet's major climate zones, exploring how moss species adapt to extremes of temperature, light, and moisture. Each adaptation, a story written over hundreds of millions of years. By viewing moss in this way, we don't just see plants. We see biological strategies fine-tuned for the specific rhythms of different worlds within our world. In tropical rainforests, such as the Amazon basin, the Congo, and Southeast Asia's Sundaland, moss finds itself in a paradise of humidity. Here, air moisture rarely drops below 80%, and precipitation may exceed 3,000 millimeters annually. The forest canopy creates a microclimate where epiphytic mosses, those growing on trees rather than soil, dominate. Species like Leucobrium, glaucum, and Calimperis afzeli form dense mats along tree trunks and branches, often mingling with lichens and liverworts. These mats act like sponges, capturing both rainwater and fog drip. Tropical mosses have developed large, thin leaves to maximize surface area for water absorption and photosynthesis in the diffuse light under the canopy. Some species have hyaline cells, specialized empty cells that store water, helping them endure short, dry spells between rain events. One remarkable adaptation is cloud stripping. In montane cloud forests, moss mats intercept airborne moisture directly from fog, contributing significantly to the forest's water budget. Studies from Ecuador's cloud forests show that mosses and bryophyte mats can increase water input to the ecosystem by up to 20% during dry periods. Nutrient acquisition here is another challenge. Rainforests have nutrient-poor soils due to rapid decomposition and leaching, so epiphytic mosses rely on atmospheric deposition, absorbing nutrients from rain, dust, and decaying organic debris trapped in their mats. In the temperate forests of Europe, North America, and parts of East Asia, moss experiences a world of change, cold winters, warm summers, and fluctuating rainfall. This requires a balance between desiccation, tolerance, and growth efficiency. Common species thrive here, often carpeting the forest floor and climbing tree trunks. Unlike their tropical relatives, many temperate mosses can enter a prolonged dormant state in winter, halting metabolic activity when covered by snow or exposed to frost. Snow cover acts as an insulating blanket, keeping moss temperatures closer to freezing than the bitter air above. This allows some photosynthesis to continue under the snowpack, particularly in late winter when light begins to penetrate the thinning snow. In deciduous forests, mosses take advantage of the leaf-off season in early spring to photosynthesize before tree canopies fully develop. Research in North American hardwood forests has shown that moss photosynthetic rates can peak in March and April, when light is abundant, but temperatures are still cool enough to limit evaporation. The boreal forests, stretching across Canada, Scandinavia, and Russia, are home to some of the planet's largest moss-dominated landscapes. Sphagnum mosses dominate bogs and wetlands here, while Polytrichum species form tall, sturdy clumps in drier soils. Boreal mosses must survive long, harsh winters with short growing seasons. Many species can photosynthesize at near freezing temperatures, giving them an advantage in spring and autumn. Their cellular structure is rich in protective compounds like flavonoids and phenolic acids, which stabilize proteins and membranes against cold damage. Sphagnum mosses play a crucial ecological role in carbon storage. Boreal peatlands hold nearly 1/3 of the world's soil carbon, despite covering only 3% of land area. This is due to sphagnum's ability to acidify its environment, slowing decomposition and locking away organic matter for millennia. In the Arctic tundra, mosses such as Sanionia uncinata and Tomentipnum nitens dominate where vascular plants struggle. Here, the growing season can be as short as 6 weeks, and temperatures hover near freezing for most of the year. Mosses in these regions often grow in tight cushions or mats that trap heat and moisture. This microclimate allows not only the moss itself, but also tiny associated organisms like springtails, nematodes, and tardigrades to survive in an otherwise inhospitable landscape. Because tundra soils are permafrost-bound, roots of vascular plants can't penetrate deeply. Mosses bypass this limitation by absorbing moisture directly from the surface and retaining it within their dense structure. They also benefit from the summer meltwater pooling in depressions, creating ideal conditions for brief but intense growth. It may seem counterintuitive, but mosses inhabit some of the driest environments on Earth. In the deserts of western North America, Australia, and parts of Asia, species like Syntrichia, Canonervis, and Bryum argenteum persist through extreme drought. Desert mosses employ poikilohydry. They completely dry out during drought and resume activity within minutes of rehydration. Some species have leaf surfaces covered in tiny hair-like structures called papillae, which scatter light to reduce heat stress and protect chlorophyll from UV radiation. Rather than relying solely on rain, desert mosses capitalize on dew and brief humidity spikes at dawn. In the Mojave Desert, researchers have documented mosses photosynthesizing for just a few hours a week during dry seasons, yet persisting for decades. High-altitude mosses live in conditions similar to the Arctic: cold temperatures, intense UV radiation, and thin soils. In the Himalayas and Andes, species like Gremia and Rhacometrium cling to bare rock, where they intercept meltwater from snow and ice. Their leaves are often covered in reflective hair points that reduce water loss and shield cells from UV damage. Many alpine mosses also produce anthocyanins, pigments that act as natural sunscreens and can give plants a reddish or purplish hue. Cities are unexpected refuges for certain mosses, especially pollution-tolerant species like Bryum argenteum. Urban mosses endure heat island effects, irregular water availability, and high pollution. Interestingly, studies in Tokyo, Berlin, and New York have shown that mosses can act as effective bioindicators of air quality, accumulating heavy metals, and particulates in measurable amounts. Antarctica's moss flora is sparse but remarkable. Species like Bryum pseudotrichotrum and Ceratodon purpureus grow in coastal ice-free areas, often in association with meltwater streams from glaciers. These mosses endure months of darkness in winter and continuous daylight in summer. They photosynthesize at near-freezing temperatures and survive desiccation during dry, windy spells. Some Antarctic mosses have been found to resume growth after being frozen for over 1,500 years in permafrost, making them some of the most resilient plants known. Mosses are often perceived as soft, silent observers in the natural world. Green patches on forest floors, stone walls, or shaded streams. Yet in the vast engine of Earth's climate, they are more than mere bystanders. Mosses, and in particular peat mosses of the genus Sphagnum, are active engineers of carbon storage on a planetary scale. They are guardians of the atmospheric balance, shaping how much carbon dioxide, CO2, remains in the air and how much is locked away for centuries or millennia. To understand the role of mosses in climate regulation, we must begin with their unique biology. Unlike most plants, mosses lack linen-rich vascular tissues that decay quickly when they die. In many moss-dominated environments, especially cool, wet, oxygen-poor conditions, decomposition slows to a crawl. The The result is an accumulation of organic matter over thousands of years. In peatlands, this accumulation can reach depths of over 10 meters, each layer a compressed record of centuries of carbon capture. Globally, peatlands occupy just about 3% of the land surface, yet they store roughly twice as much carbon as all the world's forests combined, over 550 gigatons. Sphagnum mosses are the architects of these landscapes, creating acidic, waterlogged conditions that suppress bacterial and fungal activity. Their own tissues are rich in unique phenolic compounds that further inhibit decay, effectively locking carbon into the ground. From a climate perspective, this is monumental. When mosses thrive and peatlands remain intact, they serve as carbon sinks, absorbing more CO2 from the atmosphere than they release. However, when peatlands are drained, degraded, or burned, whether for agriculture, forestry, or peat extraction, they become carbon sources, releasing centuries of stored CO2 in just decades. The shift from sink to source can accelerate climate change dramatically. Recent research, including high-resolution satellite mapping and atmospheric monitoring, has refined our understanding of moss carbon dynamics. In 2024, a global synthesis published in Nature Climate Change combined field measurements with remote sensing data to estimate that intact peat moss systems sequester an average of 0.37 gigatons of carbon annually. This may seem modest compared to total global emissions, but the cumulative effect over centuries is immense. The role of mosses in climate regulation extends beyond peatlands. Alpine moss cushions store carbon in cold, high-altitude soils. Tropical moss mats in cloud forests intercept fog and precipitation, enhancing water retention and slowing the decomposition of organic matter in the soil beneath. Even small moss colonies in temperate woodlands contribute to localized carbon storage, albeit on a smaller scale. Understanding this capacity has shifted the way conservationists view moss habitats. Protecting peatlands is not merely about preserving biodiversity, it is also a direct form of climate action. The United Nations Environment Program now lists peatland restoration as one of the most cost-effective strategies for carbon mitigation. Restoring moss-dominated wetlands, re-wetting drained bogs, and halting peat extraction are interventions that yield measurable climate benefits. The science of moss carbon storage has also deepened through paleoclimate studies. Core samples from ancient peat deposits reveal a history of atmospheric carbon levels, vegetation shifts, and climate changes stretching back tens of thousands of years. These records allow scientists to see how moss-driven carbon sequestration responded to ice ages, warm periods, and major climatic shifts. Intriguingly, during past warming events, peatlands often persisted as carbon sinks, though their storage rates slowed. In 2025, new genomic studies on sphagnum physiology provided insight into how these mosses regulate water and nutrient uptake under changing temperatures. By modulating their photosynthetic activity and altering leaf cell water storage capacity, sphagnum species can maintain carbon fixation rates even under moderate warming scenarios. This suggests a degree of resilience, though not invulnerability to climate change. Still, the threats are significant. Rising temperatures can dry peatlands, triggering oxidation and carbon release. In permafrost regions, thawing ground can transform frozen peat into greenhouse gas hotspots, emitting not only CO2 but also methane, a far more potent heat-trapping gas. Conversely, in some boreal zones, increased precipitation may expand moss growth and bolster carbon capture, illustrating that climate impacts are region-specific and complex. Beyond climate mitigation, moss carbon dynamics intersect with other planetary systems. Healthy peatlands regulate hydrology, filtering and storing vast quantities of fresh water. They host unique biodiversity, from carnivorous plants like Drosera to rare orchids and specialized insects that depend on stable, moss-built ecosystems. Disrupting these systems risks not only carbon loss, but also cascading ecological impacts. Global conservation efforts have begun to reflect this urgency. International projects like the Global Peatlands Initiative focus on mapping, monitoring, and restoring moss-dominated carbon stores. Drone-based LiDAR scanning can now map peat depth and moss health across vast areas, while portable spectrometers assess chlorophyll content to detect early signs of stress. In some regions, moss cultivation projects aim to restore degraded bogs by introducing carefully selected sphagnum species grown in nurseries. Looking ahead, the integration of moss carbon science into climate policy may prove decisive. Nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement increasingly recognize peatland protection as part of emissions reduction strategies. The challenge is translating scientific understanding into effective management, particularly in areas where economic pressures favor peatland exploitation. For the global climate engine to remain stable, mosses must continue their work as silent carbon custodians. Their resilience has carried them through ice ages and warm intervals alike. Whether they can weather the unprecedented pace of human-driven change will depend on how swiftly we act to protect and restore the ecosystems they build. In the grand narrative of climate science, mosses may not command headlines like melting glaciers or tropical deforestation. But without their quiet, persistent labor, the balance of carbon in our atmosphere would be far more precarious. The green carpets underfoot are, in truth, vast vaults of stored time, archives of the planet's slow, patient breathing. Mosses have endured for nearly 500 million years. They have outlasted ice ages, mass extinctions, and the rise and fall of entire ecosystems. Yet the challenges they face today are unlike anything in their evolutionary past. The accelerating pace of climate instability, habitat loss, pollution, and biological invasions is testing the resilience of these ancient plants in ways that may determine their future role in Earth's biosphere. The first and perhaps most pervasive threat is climate change. Mosses thrive within specific moisture and temperature ranges, finely tuned to their habitats over millennia. Rapid warming can disrupt these balances, especially in sensitive regions such as alpine zones, polar landscapes, and cloud forests. In Antarctica, where 2 native moss species dominate, warming has extended the growing season, but also increased desiccation risk during dry spells. In the Arctic, thawing permafrost threatens peat moss ecosystems that have remained frozen for centuries, releasing CO2 and methane in the process. Changes in precipitation patterns are equally critical. Mosses depend on reliable moisture availability, not just for growth, but for reproduction. Prolonged droughts can push species beyond their desiccation tolerance limits, while intense rainfall events can physically wash away mats and cushions, disrupting their microhabitats. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 2025 assessment warns that shifts in hydrological cycles will likely lead to significant contractions in moss-rich biomes by the end of the century. The second major pressure comes from habitat loss and degradation. Urban expansion, agriculture, forestry, and mining activities have fragmented or outright destroyed moss habitats worldwide. Peatlands, for example, are drained for farmland or peat extraction, stripping away ecosystems that took millennia to build. In Southeast Asia, large-scale peatland clearance for palm oil plantations has decimated sphagnum communities, with ripple effects on biodiversity and carbon storage. Even in temperate zones, smaller-scale disturbances add up. Logging operations that remove canopy cover can expose shade-adapted mosses to lethal sunlight and temperature extremes. Infrastructure projects, roads, pipelines, and hydropower dams often alter water tables and soil moisture, with cascading impacts on moss-dominated wetlands. Pollution adds another layer of stress. Mosses absorb nutrients, minerals, and airborne particles directly through their surfaces, making them highly sensitive to atmospheric contaminants. Nitrogen deposition from industrial emissions and agriculture can shift moss community composition by favoring more nitrogen-tolerant species while excluding specialists. Heavy metals such as lead, mercury, and cadmium accumulate in moss tissues, sometimes at toxic levels, impairing photosynthesis and reproduction. Because of this sensitivity, mosses are widely used as bioindicators for air quality, but their declining health often signals broader ecosystem deterioration. The spread of invasive species poses yet another challenge. Non-native mosses, vascular plants, and even certain lichens can outcompete native mosses for light, space, and water. In New Zealand, the introduction of the fast-growing Campylopus intraflexus, a moss native to South America, has displaced native cushion mosses in coastal heathlands. Similar patterns are emerging in Europe and North America, where invasive mosses alter soil chemistry and microhabitats. Modern technology has revealed just how quickly these changes can occur. Monitoring innovations, including satellite-based hyperspectral imaging, drone-mounted microclimate sensors, and environmental DNA barcoding, now allow scientists to track moss health and species shifts at unprecedented scales. The European Space Agency's 2024 Moss Map project, for example, has mapped peatland moss cover across northern latitudes with sub-meter resolution, detecting stress signals invisible to the human eye. These tools not only help document decline, but also guide conservation and restoration efforts. In Scandinavia, peatland re-wetting projects have successfully re-established sphagnum growth within 5 years of intervention. In Japan, urban moss gardens combine conservation with public education, demonstrating the ecological and cultural value of these plants. The use of laboratory-cultured moss fragments to restore degraded bogs is becoming increasingly common, with climate-controlled greenhouses producing millions of viable fragments annually. Yet despite these successes, the scale of the challenge is sobering. Global peatland restoration targets remain far below the levels needed to meet climate mitigation goals. Many moss-rich habitats lie outside protected areas, leaving them vulnerable to unsustainable land use. Public awareness of moss's ecological importance lags behind that of more charismatic species, limiting political will for large-scale conservation measures. In the face of these threats, the resilience of mosses will depend on both their inherent adaptability and our collective response. Some species may shift ranges, moving upslope or poleward as climates warm. Others may persist through physiological plasticity, altering their water storage or photosynthetic pathways. But many will require deliberate intervention, habitat protection, restoration, and global policies that recognize their role in carbon storage, water regulation, and biodiversity. The story of mosses is not merely one of fragility, but also of possibility. They have shaped ecosystems for hundreds of millions of years, and with foresight and care, they could continue to do so in the centuries ahead. But time is a factor. As with so many elements of the natural world, the window for safeguarding mosses and the services they provide is narrowing. In the quiet spaces they inhabit, mosses may seem timeless, yet in a changing world, their future is being decided now. And perhaps the next time you notice a small patch of moss on a stone, a wall, or the shaded corner of a garden, you stand still for a second, and you'll remember that something so unassuming has endured for hundreds of millions of years and still holds a quiet, vital place in the life of our planet. And somewhere, moss keeps growing.